So, welcome. I am so happy you are taking a moment out of your busy schedules to join us on a Tuesday night. I'm Ashley Walters, and I'm an assistant professor of Jewish studies here at the College of Charleston, and I'm also the director of the Pearlstein-Lipoff Center for Southern Jewish Culture. I'm joined tonight by my co-host, Kim Browdy, Associate Director for Community Relations at the college's Yashik Arnold Jewish Studies program. And I'd like to offer a hearty thanks to the Pearlstein-Lipoff Center for making tonight happen. This is the final event for the center this year, although I'm happy to share that we have already lined up an exciting list of speakers for next fall. Hopefully we'll be meeting them in person. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, including the College of Charleston's African American Studies program, the college's Department of Religious Studies, and the Yashik Arnold Jewish Studies program. So I will introduce our guest of honor in just a moment. Our agenda for the evening is to open up the floor to Professor Haynes and invite him to share a bit of his really remarkable work. I'll then take advantage of my position as host to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll begin taking questions from the audience. Throughout the event tonight, Kim and I will be moderating the chat box. So if you'd like to ask a question, please type your questions in the chat box and we'll try and get to as many of them as we possibly can in 1 hour. If you've attended our events before, then you know that we try and aim for a more informal, more personable, I should say, Q&A session. So when we come to your question, we'd like to give you the opportunity to ask it yourself. If this isn't possible, it's not a big deal. I'm happy to read the question for you. That's perfectly fine. Tonight, we will be recording this session to make it available online afterwards. So to avoid any unintended audio, please make sure your microphone is muted at all times. Okay, and now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our guest, Dr. Bruce Haynes. Dr. Haynes is a professor of sociology at the University of California in Davis, and he's also a senior fellow in the Urban Ethnography Project at Yale University. Professor Haynes is a native of Harlem, New York, which he wrote about in his memoir, Down the Up Staircase, a book he co-authored with Sima Solovich. After receiving his bachelor's in sociology from Manhattanville College, he went on to earn a doctorate in sociology from the City University of New York, and he was then appointed assistant professor of sociology and African American studies at Yale University. His most recent book, The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America, which is what we'll be discussing tonight, won the 2019 Albert J. Raboteau Book Prize for Best Book in Africana Religions. And I've read this book several times now. I assign it in each of my classes, and every single time I am blown away by the richness, the complexity, the implications of each and every story he tells. Normally I don't do this, but I'd like to quote a book review because I think it captures, and I'm sorry the lights are going out on me as I speak, it captures the magnitude of Professor Haynes' project. So Professor Michael Alexander writes, and I know all of my students in the audience know who this is because we just read his book on Jews in the Jazz Age. Professor Alexander writes, the caliber of thought and conceptualization that has gone into this book is staggering. Haynes hasn't just located a color line that segregated Jewish communities from one another and limited Jewish studies scholarship. He's crashed clear through it, His careful language regarding the trickiest matters of race, ethnicity, and religious identity will be tools we all utilize in the next several waves of scholarship as Jewish studies grapples with its color issue, as it now must. After hearing the voices represented in this book, there's no going back. Welcome to the 21st century Judaism. And I can't agree more. So I could go on and on singing Professor Haynes' praises, but I think it's time to hear from our guest. So welcome and thank you for being with us tonight. And I'll turn the Zoom mic over to you.
Can everybody hear me? And can you see the screen? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that unbelievable introduction. It's really an honor to be with you today. And especially, I know many people are really overwhelmed with doing too many Zooms. So the fact that you chose to come to another Zoom, I am especially warmed by it, because I know I'm not sure I would choose to go see myself. So I thank you for coming, and I hope to tell you a little bit about my research that I published. But before I get into that and a conversation with you, I have to stop and just thank Michael Alexander and Bruce Phillips, two scholars who really were, I had no clue how important these two gentlemen are in Jewish studies. I happened to meet them in some funny ways. Bruce Phillips I met because I was on a book committee with him at the American Sociological Association. And I thought, wow, here's a Jewish guy working on this project. Maybe he has some ideas about what I should do. And little did I know that Bruce signed on and supported me throughout this project. And it really wasn't until near the end of the project that I began to realize what an important individual he was in the field. And the same is true for Michael Alexander, who I was introduced to by a gentleman named Ben Karp, who was a former graduate student at Yale University. And he said, oh, you have to meet Michael. And I was struggling to figure out, I worked on this book for 20 years. And so finishing it was really something for me. And so those last 3 years were hard, trying to really pull everything together and have the confidence to kind of say something that was out of the box, so to speak. And they gave me the confidence to do so. And so I really want to thank them both for really supporting me. We were all standing on other people's shoulders, so I couldn't have done it without the two of them. So let me see, I get technology working, and then we'll know. We're rolling. Okay. So the title of the book is The Soul of Judaism. But first, I just want to tell you that was not the title I wanted for the book. Originally, I wanted to title this book, Hear, O Israel, Voices of Afro-American Jews. But the press wouldn't have it because they said, no one's going to understand this reference. I'm sure some of you recognize it because it's from the Shema. And I thought it was a good reference to talk about people who saw themselves as Jews, but they said, we can't advertise your book with this title. So we need something that's, going to signify race in some way. And I said, well, I don't want to put Black in the title, that reifies race. And so this is the compromise title we ended up with. At first, I really was kind of uncomfortable with it, but I've come to like it over time, I think. So I placed my book within the context of Blacks and Jewish relations, and that relationship has been called many, many things. It's been called special, it's been called a bitter alliance, it's been called a peculiar entanglement, a grand alliance. And indeed, the framing of Black-Jewish relations in this way tends to leave out a bridge between these two communities, and that's Jews of African descent. So I also want to mention that, we're in a context where anti-Semitic behavior has been rising in recent years, and we're having seen more tolerance for white supremacy that's embraced, in fact, by our former White House. And these trends are not unrelated. And so as you see this quote from Bertrand Russell, he recognized that fact too. Black Jews are often depicted in often exotic ways. If you remember back in 2019, there was a viral video depicting a large group of high school students from the Covington High School, Catholic high school in Kentucky, who are attending a conservative March for Life event there at the Lincoln Memorial. And they were confronted by a group of Black men who were wearing Old Testament-like garb and who self-identified themselves as Hebrew Israelites. Many of the boys on the steps had their Make America caps on, and the men themselves were rather intimidating, calling the boys racist and other names. These men call themselves Black Hebrew Israelites, and they believe that they are the true descendants of the ancient Israelites and that European rabbinic Jews are indeed imposters. Meanwhile, a Native American man who was singing traditional sacred chants in the hopes of diffusing tensions between the two groups ended up in a face-off with one of the high school students. And of course, that was the viral That Went video that we all got to see. And many people then began asking, well, who are these Black Hebrew Israelites? And this particular group is present in many large US cities on the East Coast, like Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago. And the Southern Poverty Law Center has in fact called them an extremist fringe of the Hebrew Israelite movement. And so this viral video is one among a typical sort of sensational representations of Hebrews, Hebrew Israelites that are found in the media. And today what I hope to do is contextualize not only these exotic folks, but I also hope to illustrate the broader Afro-American engagement with Judaism, Jewry, and Hebrewism. So first we begin with, who is a Jew? And according to Jashevsky, a Jew is someone who both considers him or herself to be Jewish and is considered to be Jewish by relevant others. Judaism is, in fact, as many of you know, a communal religion, and it requires a collectivity. Consequently, it's not enough to simply consider oneself Jewish. One must also be considered Jewish by relevant others. Yet determining who those relevant others can be very tricky, especially when the race of people of African descent has been negatively stigmatized. In fact, how other Jews accept you can have a profound influence on one's sense of Jewishness. Technical challenges moving. Okay. So, what is it to be Jewish? Is it ethnic, religious, national? Is it racial? Can Jews be Black? Can Blacks be Jews? And what are the assumptions we make if we assume that these two groups are mutually exclusive? Which in fact, when I first started my research, that's how most people approached the topic. When I said I was going to study Black Jews, they said, who are you studying, Sammy Davis Jr.? And everybody thought it was a big joke. And but really trying to understand who is Jewish and in fact who Black Jews are really depends on who you ask. Defining who is Black, just like defining who is Jewish, is a social, not a biological question. And it's societies who make up rules for determining group membership. Here in the United States, social scientists have agreed that Jews are not a racial group and that, quote, Black or Negro is a social category that varies from place to place and across time. So biologically speaking, there is no Black or Jewish gene. Nevertheless, there are commonly held assumptions about who is Black and who is Jewish in the US that are rooted in strong biological notions of group membership. Who holds identities as both Black and Jewish in America? What did people with Black and Jewish identities have to say about the secretly strained relationship, the failed romance, the peculiar entanglement, and the broken alliance? These are some of the questions that guided my research. How do people negotiate being part of these two groups that people consider to be mutually exclusive? And this was particularly true back in the 1990s, mid-1990s, when Louis Farrakhan was in the media. The secret relationship between Blacks and Jews was talked about, and a number of books were being written about the failed relationship between Blacks and Jews. So the research methods I use in studying Jews of African descent is unusual. I combine a macro level historical analysis with micro level oral histories. So I conducted field research in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, from 1998 through 1995. I conducted in-depth interviews of self-identified Black Jews between those eras. And I did participant observation. I went to events, I went to synagogues, and I took a very interdisciplinary approach to data. And so I relied on a lot of scholarship from Jewish studies, from Judaic studies, from history, whoever was talking about the topic or the period in question, I might have drawn on them. So you might say I use a temporal anchor for my project, which is the late 1990s and the early to mid 2000s, a period when a number of important things were coming together here in the United States. Number one was the growth of the internet. Number two was the Israeli airlift of Ethiopian Jews. And number three was the multiracial identity movement, which was taking place in the early 1990s as they were petitioning the Office of Budget Management for a multiracial category on the US Census. So as I began my research in the 1990s, you might say I was tapping into some of the very social networks that were emerging on the internet, and I was able to take advantage of the internet in meeting people who were somewhat isolated across the country. I could reach out and email them and make connections. And so we're talking about new and not so new Jews. We're talking about immigration of populations from the global South. We're talking about cross-cultural and cross-racial adoptions of Black children by Jews. We're talking about the growth of multiracial Jewish children. We're talking about people who've chosen to formally convert to Judaism. And we're talking about people who have identities as Hebrews or Israelites or Ethiopians and see their African heritage through a Jewish lens. And some of those people are Jews of Caribbean Jewish descent. So all of these things were taking place as I was out in the field, which of course raises the question that everybody kept asking me, are you studying Sammy Davis? So how many Black Jews are there? And unfortunately, you get a lot of different answers depending on who you ask. Surveys depend on either matrilineal or formal conversion to determine who is a Jew. That tends to be a conservative definition, a halakhic definition. And then there are more liberal estimates that include patrilineal descent or even self-identification, which may include some Hebrews or Israelites who also self-identify as Jewish. So we end up with liberal estimates and conservative estimates, and we can see that reflected in the different surveys that we see. There have been three major surveys up until this point. The first was the National Jewish Population Survey done back in 1990. That was conducted out of the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City. The American Jewish Population Survey done in 2012, and then one just after that done at the Pew Research Center. So I'll walk you through them one by one. The NJPS survey, when I first started my research, it was really the only data that was available. And at the time, it was the most comprehensive research. And it indicated that of a sample of 5.8 million Jews that they identified, that 2.4% of their sample, or 125,000 individuals, self-identified as Black. Now, I happen to know some of the scholars from that research, and I got a hold of some internal memos that suggested that they really did not believe that there were 125,000 Black Jews, and they concluded that they must be picking up Sephardic Jews who are self-identifying as Black. Now, what I know about race relations, most people who can avoid identifying as Black do so. So I didn't think that they were going to pick up Sephardic people at all. And so I think they were picking up a lot of Hebrews and Hebrew Israelites in the way they asked their screening questions. And of course, they end up with a slightly higher number than the two surveys I'm going to talk about next. So the NJPS come up with an estimate of 2.4% of 5.8 million Jews are self-identified as Black. But the American Jewish Population Survey, done at the Cohen Center, they found that 6.8 million Jews, despite the rising outmarriage rate that they identified, which in fact surpassed 50%, and they identified 4,200,000 Jewish Americans, of whom 1.6% self-identified as Black non-Hispanic. Yeah, and even their Black non-Hispanic category is a little bit different than the Black category that we had in the NJPS survey. So even these categories shift slightly depending on how they get constructed. But they're still in the same ballpark, 2.4%, 1.6%. They're not that far off. And in fact, we get more confirmation of that with the last survey done at the Pew Center in 2013, where they interviewed 3,400 Jewish Americans, and they came up with an estimate of 90,000 persons who both self-identified as non-Hispanic, Black, and Jewish, and they came up with 1.7%, just ever so slightly lower than the National Population Survey back in 1990. So we see the range is somewhere between that 1.7% and that 2.4%, most likely based on standard survey research. If we ask Jews of African descent themselves, we get a lot of different kinds of numbers, and those numbers tend to be overinflated. Religious communities, I know, tend to give the largest numbers possible in trying to count their congregations. And so we get this kind of overestimation ranging anywhere from 200,000 to 1.2 million, all of which seems grossly overestimated based on the survey research that we've seen. So if we ask folks themselves, we get bigger numbers than if we do surveys. But one of the things that is clear with the surveys is that the numbers have been growing. And in fact, upwards of 10 to 12% of the American Jewish population now self-identifies as non-white. And that is quite a dramatic change since the 1990s. And it's that shift that I think the research in my book is capturing. That shift over the past 20 years that has been taking place gradually but consistently, along with other Jews of color, Asian American Jews, Latino Jews, and all of this is added to this growing diversity and visibility of Jews of color within America's Jewish community. So this next section is divided into three parts. The first part, the changing images of the Jew, explores how notions of Orientalism and race have contextualized the encounter between Africans and Jews and shaped the social construction of Jewish identity among Jews of African descent here in the US. During the early modern era, the Orient was characterized as strange, as pre-modern, as primitive and backwards. It was also viewed as sexually exotic, foreign, mysterious, and even profound, according to Edward Said. And this process of Orientalization is relational because it's about how the West produces a modern image of itself in opposition to images of the primitivized East. And that's where we find in Venice, in the 13th and 14th centuries, Jews were Orientalized and classified as a type, and the Jewish body, which was seen as seductive and defiling, containing the lure of the Orient, became a signifier and a stigmatizer of, or master status of Jewish identity. So I show in my book how the Christian world shifted from a Jewish stigma of Jews as Christ killers to a focus on the Jewish body itself as being debased. And I argue that these ideas informed 20th century Jewish identity formation in the US as scientific racism rekindled old anxieties regarding the Jewish body. Christian Americans, all Jews were Eastern and Oriental and thus raced as Hebrew or Israelite. That's quoting Janice Fernheimer from her book. So if we look at the evolution of how Jews are framed in the Western imagination, by the 18th century, the image of the Jew as Oriental, as backward and parasitic, and as racial was widespread. Lamarckian science competed for the attention before social Darwinism and ended up competing with social Darwinism in the early 19th century. It was during this period that Africans were collectively seen as a natural race, unchanged by time, while groups like Jews and Mexicans were understood to be historic races, groups whose genetic makeup had been transformed by both climate and geography. And so as we enter the 19th century, this more racialized notion of Jews as part of the civilized and savage world gave way to Jews as being part of the West. So the distinction between civilized and savage gave way to distinctions between East and West, and the categorical differences between white and non-white. And I argue that Jews end up escaping the solidification of the color line during the 19th century because Jewish intellectuals reframed themselves in a plural, through a plural framing, using the concept of ethnicity, which was a hyphenated identity, and allowed them to escape the stigma of race by allowing you to be both Jewish and something else, be Jewish and American. And the question in the Western world was, could Jews assimilate into these new Western nations as they were forming? And Jews were seen as somewhat of an alien nation. And the question was, could Jewish loyalty shift to this new nation state, or were Jews a distinctive race that was somehow unassimilable into the Western world? And so while Jews were framed as changeable, peoples of African descent, regardless of their culture or ancestry, were collapsed into a fixed immutable category, this Black category, which signifies permanent outsider status. So ethnicity framework allowed millions of Eastern European Jewish immigrants to, quote, become white. That is, it reinforced notions that all Jews are of European descent and thus white, and it thereby, in a consequence, limited the ability of Blacks and Hebrew Israelites to assert their claims as Jews, because we started this strong association as Jews as white people. Black Jews then come to represent the merging of these two dichotomous categories, one category fluid, ethnicity, the other fixed, race, within this bifurcated system. And as we've come to see, biological notions of Blackness and Judaism have created challenges for persons with both Jewish and Black heritage, as the one-drop rule, which defines who is Black, also meets up with biological notions of Judaism, where we believe there is a linear descent from Abraham to modern day Jews. And that's when we talk about the modal Cohen haplotype and the notion of a set of Jewish genes that is identifiable, once again, biologizing the notion of Jewish ancestry. So that biological notion of Jewish ancestry, combined with this notion that Yiddishkeit, or a Jewish way of life based on a somewhat romanticized Eastern European shtetl ideal, along with the Holocaust, those two things have become cornerstones of American Jewish identity. And in fact, some scholars have gone so far to define Yiddishkeit as Jewishness. Thus, given this heavy Europeanized framework, Black Jews constitute a contradiction in terms, and they struggle to be recognized in a world that presumes that Jews, in fact, have become white. So in my interviews with biracial Jews, Black converts to Jews, and Black Hebrews and Israelites, many participants expressed feelings of alienation from their Ashkenazi brethren over this question. Rabbi Capers Finney, a convert to conservative Judaism and a spiritual leader of Beth Shalom B'nai Zakim Ethiopian Hebrew congregation in Chicago, also serves on the Chicago Board of Rabbis and on the board of the American Jewish Congress and on the Jewish Council of Urban Affairs. And he was called Obama's rabbi because of his relationship to the former First Lady. And here he shares this story with us about his friend Ephraim Isaac, the preeminent Ethiopian Yemenite scholar of ancient Semitic languages and civilizations, and who was the former director of the Institute for Semitic Studies at Princeton. And he said, people say, well, you just know about, Black Jews. Where do they come from? How can they directly prove that? And then I give them one of Dr. Ephraim Isaac's comments from Princeton, who was here lecturing and talking to about 600 women from Hadassah, a large organization of Jewish women. And after his lecture, one woman said, well, Dr. Isaac, I'm just astounded and amazed about Jews in Ethiopia and Jews in Africa. And the doctor said, I'm amazed that you're amazed. And she said, well, why? And he said, well, where are you from? And she said, well, I'm from Poland. My mother and my grandmother are from Poland and Ukraine. And he said, Ethiopia is mentioned in the Bible over 40 times. I've yet to find Poland. So I'm amazed that you're amazed. Jews of African descent also deal with what we could call a double minority status as they try to navigate being Black and Jewish in a world that stigmatizes both Blacks and Jews. Part 2, Judaism as a Black religion. Since 721 BCE, when Assyria overtook the northern kingdom of Israel, every aspect of the history and the very existence of the 10 tribes of Israel is fought with existential controversy and epistemological conundrums. Well, that's because the story of the biblical exodus of the Jews from Egypt serves as an archetype to nationhood in the Western imagination. And over the centuries, a number of varied groups, from the Celts to the Sami, to the Finns, to the Inuit, to the Maya, Berbers, the Igbo and Zulu in Africa, and even Native Americans here in the US have traced their origins to one of the lost tribes. And it's sociologist Stanford Lyman who's conducted sociological interpretation of what he calls this mytho-historical legend of the lost tribes. And it's he who concludes that every aspect of this history and the very existence of the 10 tribes of Israel is fought with existential controversy and epistemological conundrum. And while much attention has been given to the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, who have been officially recognized as a lost tribe of Dan, there is in fact greater biological merit to the claim of the Lemba, a Southern African group that has been found to carry, with the same frequency as European Jews, the signature haplotype or combination of genetic markers identified with the ancient Hebrew population. So beginning in the late 1990s, some of the Lemba chose to formally convert to conservative rabbinic Judaism as a way for them to establish legitimacy within the global Jewish community. And yet other groups, such as the Abu Yudea of Uganda, who do not claim to be descended from the ancient Israelites, have also undergone formal conversion. The precedent of the Beta Israel emboldened some sub-Saharan African groups who self-identify as Jewish to also seek official recognition. So today, an estimated 30,000 Igbo in southern Nigeria now trace their lineage to ancient Israel, citing such practices as male circumcision on the 8th day, the separation of women during their menstrual cycles, the blowing of the ram's horn, and the mourning that bears a close resemblance to the Jewish Shiva. Some of these Lemba have formally converted, while others resist, believing that to do so would undermine their original claim that they, in fact, are already Jewish. Black Jewish groups began to emerge between 1919 and 1930 here in the United States, and at least 8 different factions laid claim to Judaism. Some claimed direct lineage to Ethiopia, while others claimed more indirect roots through the Caribbean. Many, in fact, were West Indians who had ties to Marcus Garvey, the young Jamaican radical who advocated for his own kind of Black imperialism. And in fact, one of his followers, a gentleman by the name of Arnold Josiah Ford, was a Barbadian Freemason and Garveyite who in fact traced his ancestry back to the ancient Israelites, served as a rabbi for Congregation Beth B'nai Abraham in Harlem, and attracted many new Afro-Caribbean immigrants back in the 1920s from his work. It's reported that Ford studied Talmud with liberal white Jews, and yet he still asserted that, quote, real Jews were Black and that white Jews of European descent were merely offshoots of the original lineage of Black Jews, or that they were converts who had received the religion secondhand from Africans. Ford himself was influenced by the Ethiopian movement, which was popular during the period and advocated for the establishment of a homeland for Black Jews in Ethiopia. And it was, in fact, during the same time that Black Muslim groups emerged. And one key element unifying Black Jews and Black Muslims during the 1920s and 30s, during this era, is that both groups used theology as a political tool to both create community and to challenge the racist representations of Black people within the dominant mainstream culture. So we end up with a variety of groups who self-identify as Hebrew or Israelite here in the United States. The term Black Jew has been invoked as well by religiously observant groups such as Temple Bethel in Philadelphia, or the Commandment Keepers in Harlem, or Beth B'nai Zakin in Chicago, run by Rabbi Finney. But there are also Christian Israelite congregations like the Church of God and Saints in Christ. And there are Islamic Judaic groups such as the Nubian Islamic Hebrews. It has been used by movements that claim direct lineage to the lost tribes, such as the original African Hebrew Israelite nation of Jerusalem, as well as the Black supremacist groups like the Nation of Yahweh or the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge. One of the things that provides a grounding, you might say, theologically to Black Jews, Hebrewites, and Hebrews is the use of the Bible as a rhetorical strategy, using exegesis to challenge the dominant paradigms and place themselves within this quintessential story of exile and return, bondage and deliverance and redemption. And by doing so, linking the Hebrew Bible to the historical destiny of Black people as a whole. Thus, these encounters are counter-hegemonic racial projects. And what I mean by racial projects is a term borrowed from Omi and Wanant's seminal book, Racial Formation in the United States. And they define racial projects as the dynamic between the meanings one attaches to race and the distribution of social resources in accordance with those meanings. And usually that was referenced to material goods. One of the things I argue, though, is that Black Jews, Israelites, and Hebrews all use religion as a site for constructing this counter-hegemonic racial project that provides more than material goods. It also provides intangible resources like social recognition, religious legitimacy, and self-affirmation. And it's in this way that they place themselves within these biblical narratives to, in a sense, say, there we are, and there we are as legit human beings, in fact, the chosen people. One of the most important pieces of the Bible, you might say, is Psalms. This line about princes will come out of Egypt and Ethiopia will soon stretch forth her hands to God. It is one of the most often repeated quotes in the Bible. You see this amongst Hebrews and Israelites, and you also see it within the Christian church. And it is certainly one of the ways that Afro-Americans have situated themselves within that biblical history. So Rabbi Capers Finney placed it this way to me. He said, the only broad stroke that you can really say about Hebrews, Hebrew Israelites, and Black Jews is that somewhere in the context of their literature and their thinking and their psyche, they feel that Judaism is an African-born religion and faith, and that the matriarchs and patriarchs were people of color. I'm going to end here with just a short story. When I was interviewing a gentleman in the Brooklyn Orthodox community, he was of Yemenite and Ethiopian descent, and he had his own business, and he was working out of the basement of his home in the Orthodox community in Brooklyn. And he had two Ashkenazi women working for him at desks in this big room in the basement, and his desk was kind of central to the room. And I was interviewing him at his desk, and he looked up to see where the women were, see if they were busy or listening. And he leans over to me and he whispers to me that Adam was Black. And I think I almost fell over because I wasn't expecting this Ethiopian Orthodox man to talking about race at all. And then he proceeded to tell me that, of course, the matriarchs and patriarchs were also Black, but but just keep this quiet. And then we went back to our interview. And it was there that I started understanding the power of race to shape how everyone who was encountering Judaism were negotiating this color line. And although this gentleman was clearly of Ethiopian extraction because both his parents, was Jewish extraction because both of his parents were Jewish, one was Ethiopian and one was Yemenite. Every time he changed communities, he told me he went through 3 different ritual conversions as he moved around the United States, moving to different Orthodox communities, because the Bet Din of one community wasn't recognized by other communities. And so he was always in the state of illegitimacy, trying to prove his legitimacy as a Jew. And I think that's where I'll stop and open it up for questions. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Professor Haynes, I'm not sure if you're able to turn your Zoom screen on. We lost you at some point.
Oh, wow.
If not, no worries.
I'm sorry. My Zoom, well, I'm not sure when we lost me. Sorry about that.
So I'm going to dive right into student questions since I already have some coming in. For those of you that have questions, I invite you to add them to the chat right now. But we're going to begin with Micah.
All right, now I get, okay. So yeah, sorry my room's all dark, but yeah, so really interesting stuff here. So I was just wondering about these groups of self-identified Israelites / Hebrews. What percentage of them identify with the Jewish community, and what percentage of them identify something outside of that?
Well, I wish I could say there's some sort of study that looks at that, but I would just be guessing in the dark. My sense is that there's a wide variety of groups, and one has to really be particular about what group you're talking about in what particular city. And so making a generalization would really be hard.
Okay, and Kennedy?
Okay, got it. So hi. My question is, though you didn't originally want to name your book The Soul of Judaism, when you were trying to come up with another title, were you inspired by W.B. Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folk? And if so, was it due to the feelings of double consciousness or perhaps triple consciousness that Black Jews experience?
It was on that level that I ended up accepting the logic of the press and going with the title. At first, I took it as, wait, are you saying that Jews don't have soul without Black people? And so I wasn't sure how people would read it. But then eventually I started interpreting it that way, exactly. And so that's why I ended up going with it. But my point was that my original title was trying to bring some sense of legitimacy to Jews of African descent. And so using the Shema was a more subtle way of sort of making them insiders in some ways. But that was just, my fantasy. And I had to go with what the press wanted. And I'm happy to see that people interpret it, I think, more in the way that you're talking about, in that Du Boisian metaphorical way, which I'm happy about. Thanks for the question.
So I wanted to build off of a point that I think Micah was bringing up in his question, and that has to do with the policing of communal boundaries, questions of affirmation and legitimacy, which are such a huge part of your book. Part of being a Jew is identifying as such, but the other part, as you indicate, is being recognized as such by others. And so I think, if anything, your book explains that this really isn't clear cut. And we had a guest speaker in one of my classes earlier who talked about the feminist movement at the Kohanet Priestess Institute and questions about reimagining Judaism through the lens of these feminist priestesses who in many ways are kind of rethinking Judaism. So lots of questions of legitimacy and recognition here. And so I guess a question I have is, who gets to decide? Who gets to decide for Jews of African descent? And do you see this as an issue of equity?
Oh, is it an issue of equity? I guess, it's always an issue of equity, I guess, because we're always talking about, are we treating people fairly? But, a couple of things come to mind in response to your question. First is thinking about Gary Tobin. Gary Tobin was a former Brandeis professor who left Brandeis University to form with his wife the Institute for Jewish and Communal Research in San Francisco. And he got institutional funding, federation money and money from the Spielbergs and other folks, in part because the Spielbergs had African-American kids in their family. And he started doing programming for not just Jews of color, but I would say broadening the Jewish community writ large. Because Gary Tobin wrote a book called Opening the Gates, I believe it was called. And this was really his kind of, how would I describe it? His narrative to the Jewish community about why the Jewish community should be more open to its borders, to the boundaries of inclusion. And so he was looking for the big tent. And so Gary started programming. I met Gary when I first started doing my research, and he was doing some think tanks with Black Jews in San Francisco, and I was in New York making networks on the East Coast. And so he started flying me out to these think tanks that he was organizing with Black Jews from around the world. And so now he brought the Lemba, the Abu Yudea, Ethiopian Jews together with the Commandment Keepers, a couple of different Israelite groups. And he brought all these folks together along with Latin Jews, lesbian Jews. There's a lesbian rabbi there. There's a whole, this was all a big tent thing, but it was focused on Black Jews and creating some sort of institutional space for them. And the thing that was most interesting about those dialogues to me was watching what looked like an almost internal discussion amongst Black Jews about who's a real Jew and what does it mean to be Jewish, that pretty much modeled the broadest Jewish world's discussion about who's a real Jew and what does it mean to be Jewish. And so when it really came to blows, when over the weekend they chose, well, we're going to have services. All right, well, how do the groups get together for services? Well, they couldn't agree on anything. Could women read from the Torah? Could women be at the Bima? Could this be separation? And it went on and on and on, and none of the groups could agree about, you know, how to run these services. And they ended up with some crazy compromise with a kind of, I think 2 or 3 services running at the same time, I think was the ultimate compromise. But what was funny was during this conversation, I used to think it was almost like my inside joke to myself. The only thing that they could all agree on is that none of them liked Jews for Jesus. And so I thought that was hilarious. And it was almost some way sort of uniquely Jewish conversation that they were having, that they could not decide what were the boundaries. And when I looked at Jewish history, that was the thing I think most surprised me, was that you actually saw in the record Jewish communities splitting over things like, should we wear beards or not wear beards? You know, should we have a procession over this event or not a procession? And people would split over these things. And so Judaism was all about boundary making and not necessarily agreeing on where those boundaries were as you looked at different communities. And so I guess I come to myself, sort of funny way to answer your question. So I've been immersed in the Jewish community now for 25 plus years, married to my wife. We're part of the synagogue here. And people ask me, well, are you going to convert? And sometimes I think, well, I could, but pretty much I can do virtually everything I want to do in the community. And so there's only one real reason to convert, which is if I want to deepen my knowledge and learn Torah and be able to read from the Torah and do those things. Because the transferability of, you know, converting here, who knows if I go to someplace else, if they will consider that a real conversion or not. And so I recognize that the nature of the Jewish community raises those kind of fundamental questions, particularly about Jews of color. And so I wonder, well, would it do me any good? What would it mean to convert? I'm not sure. And so I can stay in a non-converted, deeply engaged state with the Jewish community.
I think this kind of builds off the question, though maybe it takes us in a different direction, but thinking about how religions function within the Black community and I guess white religions in the United States, or religions that have been practiced predominantly by white folks. Do you see Judaism as practiced by Jews who are perceived to be white versus Black Jews to function differently within the community? And also, I guess an add-on to this question would be, do you think there's a tendency to dismiss Black religions in the United States?
I'll answer the last question first, and definitely the answer is yes. There's a tendency to see Black religious as something made up. But it seems to me when we look very closely at religion, it's kind of all made up in many sociological ways. And that was actually one of the things that was insightful for me in seeing this construction of boundaries, that you're really always talking about who's the reference group, who's doing the gatekeeping, and do you care or not? And so many of the groups that may self-identify as Hebrew Israelite have no relationship to the mainstream Jewish community at all, because they're not even in their framework. And then there are others who use the King James Bible to find their way to a more traditional form of Judaism. And so that my example of that would be Temple Beth El in Philadelphia, who was founded by a Black woman who worked for a Jewish family back in the 1930s, learned about Judaism, decided that her Black congregation should become Jewish, and started moving her congregation in that direction. And then her daughter, Deborah Bowen, who is today the rabbi of that congregation, became the heir apparent and moved the community a step closer towards rabbinic Judaism. So on the one hand, most rabbinic Jews may not consider their practice consistent with all of traditional Judaism. On the other hand, at one point she was going to, I think it was the Reconstruction Rabbinic Academy, I believe, for a while, which was something that Gary Tobin had actually negotiated for her to get into the institution. Because again, to get into the institution, the question is, are you Jewish or not? And so Gary negotiated those kinds of relationships. And so you had some interesting overlaps back in the 1960s and 70s. Janice Fernheimer has a really great book that I relied on quite a bit about Hatzon Harishon, which was a group of kind of progressive Jews who started engaging with the Hebrew Israelite community in the late 60s and early 70s. And they actually had created some institutional infrastructure for a while in dialogue, and then it broke apart in the early 70s. But she tells about that story, and she also talks about she's actually a linguist, and so she talks about the rhetorical use of language, and I draw on her arguments about the way in which Israelites have used race in this rhetorical strategy to claim their humanity.
So I see we're basically out of time. May I push my luck and ask one more question?
Oh, my time is fine, so it's up to you. I'm free. Please
Okay.
ask away.
I have we just had a question come in from Sandra Brett. Sandra, are you able to ask your question?
Yeah, I was wondering about kashrut and some of those other communities that you mentioned. I know that Ethiopian Jews have different traditions concerning kashrut than those that we know from the Torah. And do some of those other global communities that you mentioned that identify as Jewish have some form of kashrut in their traditions?
It's funny. I didn't look at that for all of the different groups. The ones that come to mind, like the Ethiopian Hebrews or Rabbi Fanei, certainly are following tradition in that sense, and they also read Mishnah and Talmud. But there are other groups that are far, far away from that.
Thank you.
Sure.
So
one of the most difficult things, and I think this might answer one of the questions asked about sort of the Black religion, is that the nature of Black religion is that most of the leaders are not formally trained, whereas mainstream religion, there's a formal training for religious leadership. That combined with the kind of Old Testament notion that comes out of slave religion, that God talks directly to people. It's kind of like the burning bush world of the Old Testament. And so you don't need an intermediary in Black religion, which is what allows storefront churches sort of to pop up anywhere, and for someone to say, I've got some special connection to God, and people to believe them. And so that notion of kind of storefront churches, I'd say, has extended itself into that Hebrew Israelite world, where you have lots of different sort of small communities that maybe even have identical names, but their practices are varied. And I think that helps explain why you end up with such a wide variety of groups that seem to be similar in name, but in practice are all over the place.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess for a final question to wrap up tonight. I teach a course on the history of African Americans and Jews in the US, and we kind of flow over the centuries between different kinds of relationships and tensions, and back to relationships and tensions and whatnot. And more I'm trying to bring the story of Jews of African descent to the fore in the class. One of the things that I was so struck by in your book is you start by talking about the history of Black Jewish tensions in the United States. And in a sense, you return to it in the conclusion, and then it's not really there throughout much of the book.
Mhm.
And so what I'm curious to know is, to what extent should we be prioritizing this history of tensions when we talk about Black Jewish relationships, the experiences of African Americans and Jews in the United States? You cite Jennifer Lee, which is a book I really love teaching, Civility in the City, about Black, Jewish, and Korean relationships, and how daily interactions are in many ways so benign. And so the kind of flare-ups and tensions aren't really the main story. And so I'm wondering if
Yeah.
the story you're telling should be the story we should prioritize, because it allows us the ability to explore religion, race, relationships, power in the United States. And I think in your conclusion, you talk about a lot of the potential. So I'm just curious, is that the project you saw yourself embarking on?
You know, it was in some idealistic way. I saw that there were real Black Jews who had real life experiences as Jews and as Black people, and that their voices were not being expressed in what was this kind of public meltdown between Blacks and Jews. Meanwhile, my own personal life was my mentors were Jews. You know, I wouldn't have had my career without a guy named Jay Shulman, who was my first mentor, who was a guy who founded the National Jury Project and told me to go to graduate school. And so I sort of understood that, well, things were more complicated. So I'm like, well, we weren't in conflict. Meanwhile, Farrakhan's talking. And so, you know, seeing that there were tensions had a big influence on my interviews at the time. So I'd also add that it's kind of a period piece in the sense of my interviews are situated during that time period, the late 1990s and early 2000s. And that's when people were talking about, hey, where do you stand on Farrakhan? And that's kind of reflected in my interviews. So there is a kind of periodization of the interviews in that sense. But I also think it captures an underlying tension that has always existed in Black Jewish relations. Going back to the 20s and 30s, you know, even though we have the NAACP, we also have Jewish businesses in Harlem that don't hire or serve Black people. You know, we had Bloomstein's department store that was protested in the 1930s, but we also ended up with a Sufi who was anti-Semitic during the same period. And so it's a complicated history because Blacks and Jews are in Chicago, they're in LA, they're in New York, and they are in times competitors and they're at times allies. And I think we have to keep telling the story in that complicated way and try to be more honest with it. And I think we've told it in kind of idealistic, extreme ways, or in ways that either glorify Jews or demonize Jews. And of course, the reality is somewhere in the middle.
Well, thank you so much. I am thrilled to have this conversation with you. I could have probably asked questions all night of you, but I think your work is really a towering contribution to the field, and I look forward to reading whatever you end up writing next. And to all of you that attended, thank you so much. Many of you, I've seen your faces at each of our events this semester, and there have been a lot of them. So I appreciate you joining us night after night. Please check out our website for a list of the few remaining programs we have left this semester. And again, a hearty thanks to our co-sponsors who helped make this event happen tonight. Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks for the great questions, everybody, and thanks for the honest intellectual engagement.
Thank you.